Okay. Okay. Wow, we have 27 participants already. That we cannot see. Okay. So should I start?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. We'll go ahead. So good morning to everyone who is attending this panel. Thank you so much for dedicating your attention to it. As you know, we will be dealing today, thanks to EMED, with the very hot topic today, issue of tackling disinformation and hate speech narrative across the MENA region. As you know, it's very timely with the current news, what is happening in Lebanon, with the war in Gaza, with Islamophobia, anti-Semitism. There is many important issues related, unfortunately. And I mean, we are in a period where the world is experiencing the highest number of violent conflicts since the Second World War. And it is in this context that social media is facilitating the spread of disinformation and hate speech. We are also seeing the rise of far-right and anti-democratic narrative, who are increasing all the discourse of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia across Europe. We witnessed the Hamas terrorist attack on the 7th of October and the following brutal war that is happening in Gaza by Israel, who has totally bipolarized the infosphere worldwide, as did Ukraine or Syria, as happened with conflicts. We are seeing the impact of disinformation or the try of having these FEMI campaigns to interfere in electoral processes and the feedback. So in this session, we're going to try to explore some of these critical questions. So how these wars and international conflicts are affecting disinformation and hate speech. What are the main challenges posed by disinformation, and how are these issues impacting young people throughout all the Mediterranean region? We don't have to forget that the MENA region is 450 million and 60% are under the age of 30 years old. So it's a young population and very active into the social media sphere. Which are the limitations that are existent currently with the current measures to combat hate speech? We talk normally by the DSA, the Digital Service Act. And how can youth or civil society, journalists and fact checkers who are at the core of this fight against disinformation and any other actors across the European Mediterranean to contribute to counter disinformation and hate speech? So on this also, I would like to add the dimension that one of the speakers also mentioned, which is also we have tendency to think that the online has no borders. The net, the infosphere has no borders, but we do have some certain borders, which is the language one, and which also the cultural representations. So it brings us also to the issue of how we represent stereotypes, history, culture, ideology, disenfranchisement, how this is also related and exploited in all this narrative. So to tackle all these very important issues, or at least some of them, because it's too long for a debate, but we'll do what we can in this hour. We have three speakers today with us. I will go use by the order I have in the list, so it's not any specific one. First one is Jean-Paul Marthoz. Bienvenue. Jean-Paul is a columnist at Brussels. Sorry, I'm checking my notes here. He's a columnist at the Brussels daily Le Soir and the editorial coordinator of the annual report of the Council of Europe's Safety of Journalists platform. He's the author or co-author of around 20 books and reports on journalism and press freedom. The media and terrorism, for example, from UNESCO, En Première Ligne, Le journalisme au cœur des conflits, édition Grip, Fragile Progress, The struggle for press freedom in the EU, from the Committee to Protect Journalists, among them. He sits on the editorial board of Index on Censorship magazine, the advisory board of the Ethical Journalism Network, EGN in London, the RTBF, Francophone Belgium public broadcaster, for those who doesn't know it, and ethics committee. So in the RTBF, sorry, ethics committee, as well as the Bastogne War Museum. He has been the European Press Director of Human Rights Watch, EU correspondent of the Committee to Protect Journalists, and has taught international journalism and media and terrorism at the Catholic University of Louvain. So we'll start by him, Jean-Paul, if you would like to discuss some of the ideas.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me for this for the discussion. It's a tough issue, and it's a broad issue, and it's very difficult to sort of summarize all the ideas that are raised by the current situation in the region. It's true that the Gaza war, by its sheer brutality, I mean, from the 7 October massacres to the destructive bombing of Gaza, I mean, and this high number of casualties has triggered an avalanche of disinformation and hate speech, especially on social media. It's true that it's not just that issue; it inserts itself into a longer history of such similar phenomenon, and other areas of concern that deal with migration, still there, a big issue, feeding hate speech in many countries, or questions over terrorism. So it's just one part, but it's a huge part, and it's spanning tensions around those issues. For me, my first remark is that, weirdly, to some extent, as a journalist, I feel rather immune from the impact of disinformation and hate speech. I tend to proactively try to find sources of information, and I'm to some extent far away from the discussions that I know happens on social media. And I do discover the high level, intense level of disinformation and hate speech by talking to people who are far away from the mainstream media. I was a couple of days ago in a conference in Brussels, and I was surprised, really, that my information, the information I was managing, was completely different from the ones that I could listen from people in the room. Most of them did not consume mainstream media, or very or indirectly through social media, and they were exposed to a huge level of disinformation and hate speech. So that's the first thing. I mean, how, as a journalist, do we really know about this phenomenon of hate speech and disinformation, as by the fact that we are in a world where we're looking for information, we are reading the media of reference, we are not exposed so much to disinformation, except when there are huge cases of disinformation, quite often managed by states and governments, like was the case, for instance, during the Iraq War, or where journalists were on the front line when they were required to confront lies and half-truths that were communicated by governments. But in this particular question of Gaza, personally, except a number of moments when this information percolated into mainstream media, I feel personally not aware most of the time, except when I speak with people that do not share, they're not part of my own world. So we are, of course, because this is I mean, a very brutal war, we are in an information war. I mean, information is part of the war. It's a pillar of the war, the current war. But at the same time, we are in a war against information. The number of journalists, Palestinian journalists, who have been killed since October 7, it's just astounding. I mean, it's really the deadliest number since the Committee to Protect Journalists has started collecting data on killings of journalists. It's more than at least 116 journalists, according to CPJ, have been killed, and they have been killed because of indiscriminate shelling, but also, in some extent, because they have been targeted. I mean, the CPJ has been is investigating cases of targeting of journalists. At least 15 cases are under consideration. And Reporters Without Borders has submitted complaints to the International Criminal Court on the potential targeting of journalists, which, of course, Israel denies it's targeting journalists. It often refers to some journalists, Palestinian journalists, as people that are militants and not journalists, being linked to the Hamas military infrastructure. So we are first, this is one of the first aspects of the war on journalism in the Gaza war. The other issue is the question of the ban of access to international journalists to the Gaza territory, except under IDF surveillance. I mean, being accompanied, being embedded with Israeli forces. There are a number of questions, of course, linked to the fact that it's very difficult for journalists, Palestinian journalists, to report on the situation because of the sheer dangerosity of covering being in Gaza, because of internet shutdowns, because of displacements, because of bombing. So we are in a situation where there is a void, which of course opens up a huge space for disinformation. So if we want to fight disinformation, the first thing to do would be to reestablish basic standards and principles, allowing journalists to operate safely in Gaza. The question of the discussion about disinformation is also muddied by the fact that there's a huge polarization in the debates. I mean, it's very difficult for journalists to pretend or try to establish an independent reporting of the crisis, because the opinion is so polarized that it's very difficult to have this kind of norms being accepted as not being taking sides. If you are not with us, you're against us. This is something which pollutes the whole informational system about the Gaza war. Beside that, I mean, I have also the feeling that we tend to focus on facts, artifacts that we receive from Gaza or from other issues concerning disinformation in the region, are the facts that we receive the major story. To some extent, they are not, because these facts insert themselves into a huge and wide history, which condition the way journalists cover facts on the ground and the current news. We tend to forget, because we are journalists, because we tend to respond to accusation of bias by saying we're producing facts, that there's a huge cultural environment and context which is very difficult to handle. And to fight disinformation is to go beyond the question of fact-checking and responding to specific news items. It's really to go and understand why parts of the populations in many countries absorb and demand, to some extent, information which is not necessarily accurate, but information that reinforces their worldview and reinforces their biases. This is a key question which I think is unfortunately underestimated quite often when fact checkers or people fighting disinformation are thinking about the way to address those questions. So these are the first remarks that I wanted to mention about that issue.
Merci, thank you so much, Jean-Paul. Let's then also give the floor to our second speaker, Shada Islam. Ahlan. And let me do a little introduction, although I cannot reflect everything that our speakers have done, but I will try to summarize a little bio. So Shada Islam, she's an influential Brussels-based specialist on European Union affairs who works independently as a commentator, She's an advisor, analyst, strategist, and media trainer. So multidisciplinary. Her areas of interest and specification include Europe, but also Asia, Africa, geopolitics, trade, migration and inclusion, diversity, and women's empowerment. She runs her own Brussels-based global strategy and advisory media company, New Horizons Projects. And she is also a visiting professor at the College of Europe and a Solvay Fellow at the Vrije University Brussels, VUB. In 2017, she was selected as one of the 20 most influential women in Brussels by the magazine Politico. And in 2023, she was identified as one of the 50 top influencers in Brussels by ZN Consulting. I have a warning that my connection is unstable. Can you hear me properly?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, just to finalize a little bit, Shada has spent most of her professional life researching, writing, analyzing, and speaking about the European Union and its relation with Asia and Africa, as well as EU development policy, trade policy, and migration. So I think she will have a very interesting perspective to bring us also on this topic. Thank you very much, Shada, for being here. Thank you very much, Shada, for being here.
Thank you so much, Natalia, and thank you to Ahmed for bringing me here. Look, I'm going to be quite frank and open about a topic which is dear to my heart. As a brown European, as a Muslim woman, working for international media, some of them in Europe, some of them in Asia and Africa, I do not live in a bubble where misinformation is outside my ambit. I envy those, and Jean-Paul, I envy you if you think that, you know, it's a very rare thing. I live in the midst of a war of narratives, and propaganda has always been, a weapon of war. But what we're seeing now is something that is has real life implications in terms of people's lives. And we're talking about a world of us and them narratives, and it's Edward Said's Orientalism really in play. Now, I think that what we're living through as journalists, and I've been a journalist for 40 years as well, this is part of a wider problem. And the problem is, of course, Jean-Paul has made reference to it, is that it's the human cost of the war in Gaza. I'm going to focus on the war in Gaza, not Ukraine at this time. We talk a lot about Ukraine in Brussels and not enough about Gaza. It's been a catastrophic year in terms of human cost, targeted killings of Palestinian journalists on a daily basis, with very little response from Western media, which I find absolutely unacceptable. We are all colleagues, or we're not colleagues at all. It's the indifference that really kills, and I think this is terrible. What we're also seeing in the West is cancellation of journalists who have pro-Palestinian feelings, who show solidarity towards Palestine. They're being cancelled by major European media. There's a form of self-censorship that's come into our jobs because we're afraid of losing our jobs. And so there's a reluctance, and this has massive implications for journalism. There's a reluctance to speak truth to power. And we see this on a daily basis in many European capitals. Many of us, including me, who do write about Gaza, are the subject of immense online hatred, sometimes from people we know. So this is something that we live on a daily basis. And this leads to, as I said, real-time violence. Now, I believe very much that Western media, for which I do work, has lost its reputation as an objective and impartial view of what's happening. You know, it is constantly, and I'm talking about major publications here, constantly accused, and rightly so, I would say, of pro-Israeli bias. And it has really fabricated or listened, sorry, not fabricated itself perhaps, but listened very carefully and disseminated fabricated news that comes out of Israel. And this has led to a loss of trust for mainstream media. And for those of us who grew up believing in the sanctity and objectivity and the standards, the gold standards set by newspapers like the New York Times or the Washington Post or even the BBC now find ourselves in a situation where we really cannot believe everything they say because they are falling into the misinformation trap. So it's not just social media, Natalia, and I'm very, very adamant about that. And more people are turning to social media, especially young people, because they do not have any trust or confidence in mainstream media, which, as I said, has become really a sort of channel for misinformation. And we've just seen the huge, we've seen so many cases, I won't name them, but we've seen just now the Jewish Chronicle in the UK, which is a very respected publication, having to admit that it has been disseminating false newspaper articles. So this is something that we care about a lot. And then there's also misinformation or bias in the use of the passive voice. Now, if you're writing in English and you've seen the headlines, Palestinians just die. They just fall down and die. There's hardly any reference, or very few references. It's beginning to be there now about how they actually died. What happened? Who killed them? Where did the bombs fall from? So this is subtle information, subtle misinformation. And so, you can criticize social media, but mainstream journalism, and once again, I say, I have great respect for these publications, but they're falling into a trap. And then there is also misinformation by politicians, which I think is something so unacceptable, where they are, and we've seen this in the case of the White House, we've seen it in the case of Joe Biden, but also here in Europe, the way everyone just believed that UNRWA, the UN Palestinian Refugee Organization, was falling into this trap of having Hamas, people working for them, which was complete and utter nonsense. We believed it, and there's an immediate reaction from parts of the Commission to stop aid to UNRWA. Of course, that was then, researched and investigated, and funding was restored. But misinformation and the way our mainstream politicians have been sort of repeating fake news is really something which has, I think, very troubling consequences. Which finally, there is misinformation, fake news on social media. I mean, you and I, journalists who have a certain sort of experience of this, we can detect it immediately. Jean-Paul is right. We see it. We know this is fake. We do our own investigation, and we come to our own sort of thinking and our results. But for other people, this is very dangerous. You're using old photos, video games. You're using, you're using misinformation contractors. I mean, all of the time, this is something that we have to take into account. But it's not the only problem. It's not the only problem. We're living in a world of misinformation by some very formally respected politicians and mainstream media as well. And for me, that is a real problem, because there we are not looking with, suspicious or wary eyes. We're falling into the trap. And so this would be some of the most dangerous developments that I see because of the Gaza war. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shada. We'll move on to our third and last speaker, Xavier Mas de Xaxàs. No sé si digo bien tu nombre.
Yes, perfect.
Bon dia. Thank you for being here, Xavier. We like to have, I will make also a little short introduction so you know a little bit more about Xavier. He's a diplomatic correspondent for La Vanguardia, the newspaper where he has spent his entire career. There are still journalists like that, which began with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. Since then, he has covered major international events as well as numerous conflicts, particularly in the Middle East. He was a correspondent in the United States, where he witnessed the 9/11 attack. Following that experience, he published the book La Sonrisa Americana, The American Smile, Random House editions. And his latest book is titled El Árbol del Mundo, published in Libros de Vanguardia, which is the tree of the world, if I make the rough translation to English. And it's a personal account of what he has experienced and thought about in the places that have shaped the present over the last 3 decades. He's also the co-author of the interview series, Giardinetto Sessions. How I'm challenged on the kind of Italian side. Thank you for being here, Xavier, and give you the floor.
Okay, thank you very much, Natalia. And thank you to Ayamet, and thank you to Jean-Paul and Shada for sharing with us your thoughts, which are also mine. I deeply understand Shada's point of view. I've been writing a lot about Gaza and Israel, and before that, not only in this war, but for many, many years. And the situation is indeed getting worse. For an unbiased information of what's going on, starting by the fact that we cannot enter Gaza. We cannot inform from Gaza, so we have to rely on Israeli information and Israeli censorship, and of course from the colleagues who are in Gaza, the Palestinians who were already living there before October 7, and it's a disgrace for all of us to see how many of them have already died and been targeted, as Jean-Paul has said. No, saying that and focusing on disinformation, we all know that erodes democracy. We all know that politicians, as Shada says, are involved in disinformation. It's a tool of war, as Jean-Paul has said, and all those false narratives are spreading with malign intent more and more faster than ever. It's not propaganda as it used to be. It's a completely different scenario. And I want I see disinformation as a weapon. It's not just a tool of war. In fact, it's a weapon. And if we approach disinformation as a weapon, I think we can understand easily who is launching those weapons and who are the targets and the victims. The European Union Foreign Action Service has been documenting all the attacks we are receiving every year. Every year there's more than 600. That's more than 2 a day. They are launched like rockets from hundreds of platforms at the same time. Those platforms belong or are in close relationship with governments, with politicians, with associations linked to different number of interests. We'll see a Sputnik or RT or Telegram in the orbit of the Kremlin, but we also have TikTok and other in the orbit of the Chinese government. And of course, also there are many in the Israeli interest regarding the ongoing war in Gaza. The target is the population, the population in the main information markets. Jean-Paul and I are immune to disinformation because we read the trusted source of the media, no? But there are so many millions and millions of people all around, and Shada is very well in her point that she's a victim also of this information, where you're in the middle of this impact of the rockets, of the weapons thrown by all those platforms at the same time. Then when the misinformation is launched and it reaches its target, and we know that lies travels 4 times faster than truth, then the impact is magnified by influencers and by mainstream media. The mainstream media are magnifying all those false narratives that are launched from those platforms, and they are spreading very, very rapidly through bots, being human and not human, and another media. From launch to neutralization, and that's a calculation made by the European Union Foreign Action Service, from launch to interception or neutralization, you need 37 hours. That means that you need to counterattack with a new narrative, the narrative that is straight with the facts, and is so slow that when you react and you were able to overcome the impact of the disinformation, it's too late. It's too late. It's too far away now. There's so many people contaminated by this impact. So the better strategy is to strike before lunch. That means working with secret services, working with techniques used against cybercrime, identifying those platforms, identifying the actors of the aggressors, their patterns, and being able to strike before they spread this disinformation. That's easier said than done. We need international coordinated effort. We don't have that yet. It's not a problem that affects only one country. It's a problem affecting everybody. So we need an international body able, from one side, to counterattack with concrete technological measures to avoid the dissemination of those false narratives. And then at the same time, we need an international body, an independent international body, to certify which media are doing things right. I think that information is a public good. It's not just a private. Even if it's done by private companies, it's a public. It's in the public domain. So it's not only for sale. No, it should be treated as we treat food, or as we treat all the communities that are essential for our lives. Drugs, vaccines, anything that needs to pass all the standards of quality needed. And we need to certify which media are doing their job properly, or which media are voluntarily disseminating disinformation. Of course, this is a very narrow and a very tricky area. Of course, freedom of speech, freedom of information should be preserved at all costs. But I think that we have to go in the offense, and we have to be bold, and we have to take risk, limiting the maybe with some side damage at the beginning while we learn how to do it. But we have to stop the dissemination of these false narratives through the implementation of techniques at the international level. If we do something in Spain, or you do something in Brussels, it's not enough. It should be an international body and a commitment, at least by many nations, to avoid these weapons from our lives. No, they are targeting constantly, more than twice a day, with this disinformation that causes so much damage to our way of living, to our democracy, that I can understand why the international institutions haven't done more to prevent it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Xavier. Decidedly, the regulation and on the private platforms is one of the big issues that actually the EU is working on it. And a bigger door who is opening with the artificial intelligence and how to regulate this on the future. Now it's going towards the labeling of the productions, but it's going to be a big question also to open. I'm going to take advantage of, before passing, to make one specific question to each of the speakers, to remind to the participants that please, can you write the questions you have? You should have a little space down on the screen to write your questions. As we'll be giving some time at the end for questions and answers. So please, if you have any, don't hesitate to write it already. I will be compiling them, and then we'll pick some of them to be questioned for the speakers. But I have one already for Jean-Paul, if it's possible. You spoke about this unprecedented situation that is happening in Gaza, this media embargo, which is absolute. I don't think we have seen this in any other conflict. I was thinking in the Islamic State, it was one of the places where journalists were killed inside and foreigners were not able to enter. And we have this absolute control of narrative for one of the actors. So it's quite unprecedented. But I wanted to pose you, I know it's a question, but just to be pragmatic on the solution thing. We are under the dictature of the immediacy in news. Everything has to be now. given, and journalists and newsrooms are exposed to this demand of immediacy. And at the same time, we are bombarded by disinformation by every corner. What is the role of the newsroom and the journalists in this, in keeping about the disinformation for the reader to be the gatekeeper of the information, and how much has it affected the agenda of the journalism also? Because as Shada said, the journalists should be there to speak truth to power. But if we have journalists who are spending their day in the banking possible disinformation, the agenda is dictated by disinformation actors, and the news are no more in charge of the agenda of what they should be informed to citizens. So how is the best way, what journalists and newsrooms can do to fulfill their job of setting the agenda and information, not only be passive to it, and on the cutting disinformation? Thank you.
No, I think that journalists have to reaffirm their autonomy, I mean, in relation to both government authorities or any actors in the issue at stake, but also their autonomy in relation to what's being produced and being circulated in the social media field. I mean, this question of following agendas or following discourses or following flows of disinformation is an impasse for journalism. So the big question today for journalism, and I would be a bit less severe than Shada on the Western media in the coverage of the Gaza war. I mean, a couple of reference newspapers and even broadcasters have done not always a perfect job, and sometimes have expressed what would be considered, it has been denounced by many as pro-Israeli bias, but at the same time, even the New York Times, for instance, they have produced a number of investigations contradicting the Israeli discourse. They have been putting op-eds or columnists that have been very hostile to the current Israeli government. So I would be a bit less severe. I have myself, as a journalist, but also as a member of the Committee of Ethics of the Public Broadcaster in Belgium, I mean, the accusations of bias have come from all sides. It doesn't mean that the coverage of the story has been perfect, because we have been assailed both by pro-Palestinian and both by pro-Israelis, but at least a number of journalists have been trying in newsrooms, even when those newsrooms have or might be accused of having a pro-Israeli position, they have been fighting for their autonomy, for their right to try to present the crisis in the most balanced way as possible. And even the question of being balanced has been discussed in newsroom. Can you be just balanced in front of what's happening in terms of violence in Gaza or not? Those questions have been raised in newsroom. So, but for me, I mean, the real issue is really for the media to assert, I mean, their the mission that ideally they are expected to do. Basically, is really trying to have their own investigations into what's happening, trying to find the right sources, trying to present as many examples as possible of what's happening in Gaza, being the first one to try to go to see through the disinformation or psy-ops operations of actors trying to influence the coverage of Gaza. And all those things, I mean, have been tried. I mean, if I see, for instance, some newspapers, even like Le Monde, for instance, I might perhaps be biased in favor of that paper, or but personally, I think that I have been trying to provide a very balanced information about Gaza, trying to decide what kind of priorities they will focus on, and not being drawn into following what's being done and what's being circulated in social media, or sponsored by groups that take a specific stance on the issue, or people harassing journalists. And I understand Shada's remarks on being harassed online by people questioning her position, her view on Gaza. It's a reality that's really pushing some journalists to self-censor, because the pressures and the tensions created by this online, but not only online, it's also phone calls to editors-in-chief. I mean, saying you should take another position because you will be accused of being either anti-Semitic or whatever. All those questions are central to the definition of a journalist as actors that have to stick to the basic principles, seeking the truth independently, thinking about the impact of what they do, working transparently, explaining why they do their coverage the way they do, which is something which is fundamental in pushing for more integrity in the coverage of such a complex and difficult and tense issue. These are a few ideas about it.
Merci, Jean-Paul. Thank you very much. There is another issue I would like to address to Shada, which is actually very important, and is the impact. This year, we witnessed 70 electoral process. It's mean half of the world were in elections, and how a narrative and disinformation are taking advantage to try to influence these elections and put certain are not other leaders in power. You are an expert in Europe, Shada, and there is where the discourse of anti-Semitism in one side and Islamophobia in the other has been widespread, many of it by the far-right discourse and speech, and ahead of elections. We have many European countries in elections and the European Union itself. So how have these dynamics influenced, either vice versa, politicians to the narrative among population and the population far right among elections? If you can tell us something about this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Natalia. I think as regards my difference of opinion with Jean-Paul, we can agree to disagree. But I think from the moment Western journalists, and I put myself in that basket, agreed to be embedded with military forces, I think for us that was the death knell of objectivity and impartiality. And I think for that decision that was taken during the Iraq War, we will never ever overcome that loss of trust that comes with it. And you know, Xavier, in my world, and I work a lot with young people as well, I teach, there is no trusted source. There is no longer a trusted source. And I think this is something important that journalists of our maturity and our experience have to recognize. We are accused of double standards, and we see it every day over Ukraine. And the same thing is happening in Gaza, the violation of international law. Who dares to call it out as such? The Guardian once in a while will do it, but it's always sort of, you know, velvet gloves, you know. The biggest misinformation, Natalia, and I'm coming to your question about the far right, is that the biggest is that to criticize Israel is to be anti-Semitic. I mean, this is for me the biggest misinformation, fake news, disinformation, call it what you will, which is putting a stranglehold, is shackling so many people from coming out and being truthful, you know. And when you have a situation where certain things are verboten, are forbidden, there are taboos, you kill journalism, you kill free expression. And we're seeing that every day. And, you know, when we talk about social media, TikTok, etc., and we fight against misinformation, my fear is that what we're really doing is also fighting against younger people expressing themselves more openly than they can on, you know, social, expressing themselves more openly in solidarity with what they see as a violation, egregious violation of international law on TikTok, which they cannot do with the mainstream media. Now, we've seen, you know, the Gaza war has increased the number of anti-Semitic, of course, horrible, which the European authorities are taking very seriously. And I'm very happy to say that. I only wish they would do the same thing with Islamophobia, which is not the case. It is not the case. And I can put my hand in the fire and say this is not the case. In fact, they are amplifying, magnifying the anti-Muslim hatred that the far right is disseminating. Most of our mainstream politicians are actually embracing that rhetoric to think, because they think they will win votes this way, right? But the result is that the far right discourse on Muslims as being potential terrorists, all of them, right? Collective stigmatization, all of that has become mainstream. And when you listen to the discourses, I'm sorry to say, of some of our senior European politicians in the parliament or outside it, frankly, as one of my friends said to me, we don't need the alternative for Deutschland. We don't need the extreme hard right, because we're hearing the same rhetoric, the same insults and offensive language, the same collective stigmatization from our mainstream politicians. And this has to be taken in hand, but it's not being done. We've seen that, we saw that at Southport, right? There was this horrible stabbing that was, done by a British Rwandan. Suddenly, the far right puts it on social media that it was a Muslim. And what did we see? We saw real-time violence against Muslims. It happens all the time in Germany. It happens all the time in France. It happens everywhere. So our governments are not reacting, Xavier, as you said, very quickly on the spot, trying to cool down passions. In fact, our mainstream politicians are amplifying and fanning the fires of hatred, communal hatred across Europe. I find that extremely, extremely tragic. And I think this will come back to bite us, because we're walking into a trap that the far right has set for us, and we're all walking into it, sleepwalking into it. And, we know what happens when that happens, right? We've been through it.
Thank you, Shada. I'm going to, for the purpose of timing, I'm going to combine the question I wanted to make to Xavier with one of the participants. I wanted to address, we have seen the newsrooms a little bit with Jean-Paul, we discuss it, and then with Shada, the role of the politicians also. But there's one thing also, which is the narrative. So are we being biased already in journalism? Shada mentioned before that how we say Palestinians, thousands of Palestinians died and not are killed. We don't mention the perpetrator, or we mention terrorist group, movement of resistant movement. This all narrative that is going around is impregnated the media, and somehow we contribute to this confusion. So one of the questions of one of the participants is, and I will read it, how can a journalist ensure that he or she is immune to disinformation when even the most reliable sources can turn out to be misleading? And the participant gives an example, which is when the information is provided by an official source from the Israeli army or government that they somehow know will write, and European journalists will take it as accurate because it's coming from an official source. So in this narrative that the media are vehiculating, how can the journalist himself protect from this, knowing the example that have been given?
Well, you have to do your job. You have to check your sources and recheck your sources and find more than one source. That's the main teaching, in journalism schools. But of course, everybody is a target. Nobody is immune to disinformation. Nobody is immune. We have to be humble regarding how we approach information, not taking anything for granted, and being able to see things by yourself. We are not in Gaza, as I said before, and that's is such a huge hurdle to inform properly. And you have to rely on phone calls, on video calls from our sources in Gaza. But if you can go to the place where the news is developing, you have to be there. We don't do that as much as we used to because we rely so much in technology to link us to our sources that I think that's is not enough. We need a physical presence in the place where the news is developing. Saying that, we have to. I agree with Shada that there's a lot of mistrust against mainstream media, but we are not all the same. We have to distinguish who is doing right and who is doing wrong, and we have to teach everybody in our society maybe to consume 2 or 3 or 4 different media outlets. Read here, read there, and make up your mind. Don't trust just one source of information. Please, if you're reading an Israeli paper, okay, then read what is printing in Cairo, which is being said in Beijing or in Moscow or in Washington. Be able to spread your sources of information as a citizen. And if you do that, I'm sure that you will end up with quite an accurate idea of what's going on.
Thank you, Xavier. I'm gonna now pass to read some of the questions we have from the participants, which are actually, if I can combine a couple of them, they are addressing one of the participants were right to point that we have focusing more on the content aspect, but less on how it is spread. So the channels of vehiculation for disinformation. So especially mentioning algorithm and the lack of moderation of these algorithms and the private platforms. So in this case, there is a couple of questions addressed to it. One of them is there any hub in the European community tracking how this phenomenon is evolving and using as counter-speech the theoretical results that the researchers are representing nowadays? So how is this used within the European Union? Does this exist? Are there any mechanism? And I'm going to join also for the purpose of timing in this same direction of the question. I will let you, any one of you, reply on this, on the more regulation aspect of it. The other was a question more addressed, directed to Xavier, but anyone can reply, of course. Is, in your opinion, how could the international community propose a plan to establish a credible and respected independent international body dedicated to combating disinformation? Additionally, how will this body integrate into global landscape where existing international institutions are in decline and where different international actors have divergent ideas of information of control? So a little bit of a question of view of how these institutions are working to control the private platforms, the algorithms, so the channels through this information is spread. And also the question that this participant does is like, if you are having these organizations in charge of doing the policing and states themselves that are interested, how can this happen worldwide?
So who starts? Regarding how we organize this labeling or this quality control of the media is a very tricky question because, of course, it's very difficult to do it right. How would I start? I would start to establish an alliance of schools of journalism. I think this quality control should be done from the academia, not from any political institution, even if it's international. It should be shielded from political influence. So the best schools of journalism, the best universities around the world, willing to cooperate, creating this pattern of good behavior and this pattern of identifying disinformation. I think that will be a good start. But I know it's more utopian than realistic, no? But I think we have to walk in this direction in order to increase the quality of our media.
Mm. On the question of regulation, if I may, Natalia, so the EU is spending a lot of money and doing a lot of research on the issue of misinformation, disinformation, fake news. It's been a huge story on Ukraine. It's been a huge story during the European elections. And I know that there are efforts. I'm not inside the institutions by any means, and I'm happy for that. So monitoring and regulation. So there's the European Digital Media Observatory, I think Stratcom, where you've been, spent some time as well, just finding out the stories, debunking them, pre-debunking. I think von der Leyen, the commissioner, has called it something like pre-bunking or something, pre-debunking. So actually being on the alert and doing it as quickly as possible. Of course, you saw the recent story where the former Commissioner Thierry Breton took issue with Elon Musk on Twitter and warned him about disinformation. And then, of course, other officials, including von der Leyen, came in and walked it back a tiny bit. But there is a great deal of engagement with social media platforms to try and make sure that they're accountable, whether it's Facebook, Meta, X, all of them. Telegram, you saw what's happened with the owner of Telegram. He's actually in prison in France at the moment. There are public awareness campaigns. I mean, we're bombarded with these campaigns warning us to be very careful. If we don't vote, somebody else will do it for us, that kind of thing. And what I find really, really good in the case of the Gaza war are fact-checking initiatives done by Palestinian journalists in Palestine. Midan is one of them. You've heard about it, of course, and Kashif. There are others that IEMED has talked about. And their chapeau, honestly, I cannot say how much I admire these wonderful people, hardworking people, like many journalists in Palestine, who are going out of the way to debunk certain stories and have actually led the way. My only concern, Xavier, is anyone listening to them? Is anyone actually paying attention to the fact-checking that these wonderful, heroic people are doing? So there's a lot going on, and I have a feeling that as we go towards the presidential elections in the US, so of course there's a lot of fake news and misinformation, I would say even more than here, this issue will become even more politically volatile and politically explosive.
Jean-Paul, I don't know if you want to intervene on this, but otherwise I have a more geopolitical question here regarding to disinformation, which is, could you touch upon Iran's, I mean, we haven't talked very specifically on the political sphere or roles of or specific actors, but one of the participants would like that we engage in this line, which is, could you touch upon Iran's role in the context of disinformation and the current Gaza-Israel war? So perhaps you want to take that question.
You mean me?
Yeah.
Oh, no, sorry. No,
You're
I just wanted to come back to the discussion of a regulation of hate speech. I mean, I think that it's something that Europeans have been trying to do, I mean, to regulate more severely hate speech online. And I think it's not something which you have to do better, in the sense that hate speech is not free speech. And the tensions between European leaders in this with people linked to the GAFAM in the US is fundamental. We shouldn't accept in Europe the concept of First Amendment, which allows in the US incitement to violence and hate, which is something which has to be clearly defined as a European way of dissociating themselves from this concept that Elon Musk has been pushing as a free speech absolutist, with the consequences that we know on democracy, on coexistence. And so I do think we have to be very clear on this. Regulation is one option. But I have to insist also that we have to be very careful when we try to regulate, when we try also to certify. There's a very difficult balance to protect, I mean, between the attempt to turn the media sphere into something more decent, and the danger, of course, of suppressing ideas that might upset us. So this is something on which we have to have more discussion. And concerning the effect of fact-checking on the general discourse and disinformation, I fear, unfortunately, that fact-checkers, sort of are preaching to the converted, and to some extent, even fact-checkers as they come from news organizations that, as Shada and Xavier mentioned, suffer from mistrust among these particular sectors of the population which have a negative perception of mainstream media. Because fact checkers come from these media, they're not credible. Quite often, they tend to be seen as adding disinformation to the disinformation that they pretend to uncover and expose. So we have to go further into those issues and talk much more about the way we can address disinformation beyond what has been done at this stage. And what has been done at this stage has been inefficient in curbing the flow of disinformation, whether it comes from social media, but also, of course, when it comes from authorities and politicians are the ones that we should focus on in the first place.
Thank you very much. I don't know if we have the time to take one more question. If participants are still here, attendees and speakers have still time, perhaps we can take one last one.
Mm-hmm.
So if I'm tempted to pose mine or pose the participants, but I think the participants have priority, so I will do I will throw the two questions and then you pick what you want to reply. But just I will add a little comment. I was thinking yesterday in another panel that someone mentioned that Facebook has 3 billion followers and the New York Times 10 million. So it gives you a little bit of the powerless of the media facing to the social media. I think this is something we have to reflect how it shouldn't be journalists versus social media, but something which is complementary. But is a very difficult thing to do, something that the role of fact checkers and journalists. I think there's a lot of misinformation. There's more misinformation than disinformation going around. So perhaps misinformation should be, which is perhaps 80% of what goes around, it should be done by the newsrooms filter over there, the information that is coming out. And the 20% disinformation, which are deliberate attempted attacks to countries by foreign actors, this is a specialty of fact checkers. This is my personal view, of course, that there is a division of labor here to do on what is disinfo and what is the rest, because we confuse a lot of terminology on what is fake news. And there's a lot of vocabulary like the grassroots or defamation or killing the character or all this. So just for the division of role. So very quick, used to recall the role of Iran. I'm sorry, talking about, I wanted to point to this Facebook presence of half of the world population having an account in Facebook almost, and 10 million subscribers to the New York Times. I wanted to do this because we haven't touched upon the media sphere in the Arab region, in the Middle East, in the MENA region. Shada has rightly pointed to these fact checkers, and let's say there has been a division of traditional media there, which is not as open or free, let's say, and independent media, which is more digital, and the fact checkers. So how this is impacting also this information in MENA is different than how is it impacting here. Therefore, the pertinence of the question, what is Iran's role in the context of disinformation and the current Gaza and Israel war? Because I think the impact is very different in Arab media that it is having in Western or Anglophone infosphere. And there's the last question, which is directed to, so if anyone wants to comment on Iran, and I will throw the other question, which is directed to Shada Islam, but could go to anyone, who say, don't you think that apart from regulation of content and fact-checking, the priority should be to deeply decolonize media and how it should look like? And I pose this question because I think Jean-Paul also can comment on perceptions and culture and how this plays an important role in playing and pushing the button for hate speech. And I leave it to you. Perhaps we can talk more like 5-10 more minutes and then just close it for today.
Can I come in, Natalia, because I do have another appointment at 1:30 and
Sure.
I need to make my way. I don't have much to say about Iran, but the misinformation contractors are everywhere. If I may point out, we know we talk about Iran, but my research shows that a lot of the actual hate words and hate speech when it comes to Gaza is coming from India against Palestinians. This is something I did not know, but I want to share it with my colleagues. Bot accounts, there is one that is famous now, originating in Bangladesh, which is anti-Palestinian, anti-Gaza. So bot accounts, fake profiles are, I'm sure Iran is doing it as well. I'm not a specialist on what they're doing, but I was absolutely astonished and alarmed to see it doesn't necessarily have to originate in a country that is seen as a player in the Middle East, but in the countries outside. Something that we have to worry about. The question on decolonizing the media, absolutely. And I'm very, very involved in these conversations because a lot of our us and them narratives, I've been becoming more and more aware of it. I have to say, since the pandemic has made it very clear to us that in our media, we have, even if there are people like myself working there, we are imbued with a certain culture of thinking that we know best in the West. And I'm not criticizing my colleagues here. I've played the same role for many, many years, and we have things to bring to the table, and we do not have anything to learn from our colleagues in developing countries in the global South. And we're seeing to what extent this can actually change, and it's changing now. The best information I'm getting, the most, I would say, trustworthy information I'm getting is from my colleagues in the Middle East, in the global South. When I need to know something that's happening, pick up the phone, call up a think tanker, call up a colleague in the global South and get their impression. So I think we are living through a decolonization moment, which goes beyond media. Of course, it also goes into our policies. We in the European Union are very reluctant to engage in these issues because we built our value system, we built our whole edifice on the basis of Eurocentrism. And it's becoming something that I think is being challenged enormously. And I've written for Afkar on that, challenged enormously by countries in the global South, not necessarily the autocracies or the monarchies in the Middle East, but by countries like Brazil, by South Africa, Malaysia, Indonesia, not necessarily by China, but by the countries. So we're living in a multipolar world, and the media, realm has to and is beginning to show those fractures, and the fact that we're turning now to sources that I consider very, very reliable, which are often in the global South and not in the global West.
Thank you very much, Shada. Feel free to leave whenever you have to join your night appointment. And I will give like 4 more minutes for any Xavier or Jean-Paul, if anyone wants to add anything before we close.
Just one quick observation. It's not the same a subscription to the New York Times than a subscription or an account in Facebook or other social media. As Shada has appointed, there are so many bots accounts, there are so many followers who are not even human. So we have to take into account also the quality of the audience. And I think that's very important for the influence.
Good point. Thank you, Xavier. Jean-Paul?
2 quick points. I agree with Shada on the fact that they are in the South. I mean, voices in journalism that have been excellent. And if you see, for instance, Courrier International in France, which publishes articles from newspapers from around the world, you can see that there's a real global South quality of journalism, which acts as a correction sometimes precisely on Western media that have slowly been losing their hegemony on the way they tell us about the world. This is the first remark. The second remark, I mean, we have not really mentioned press freedom in that discussion, whereas in the MENA region, I mean, press freedom is a big issue and it determines the way disinformation functions, disinformation which is produced by government, but also by other groups. It's one issue. But also, we have problems with press freedom in increasing number of European countries. I mean, there's backsliding in many European countries with press freedom, and I do think that we cannot really address the question of disinformation if we don't see it within the context of promoting press freedom. And that should be something which European Union should be sustaining by defending the rule of law. I mean, in its member states, in Hungary or other countries, Slovakia, other countries where the press is under pressure, but also in its external relations, it should really insist on defending press freedom and should give a priority in its funding to independent journalism, who are even in autocracies in MENA countries. I mean, are still trying and taking risk to produce information which responds to the best criteria of journalism, even at running, I mean, having to incur many risks by doing so. So press freedom should be a permanent and ingredient in the discussion about disinformation.
Thank you very much to all on this point, Jean-Paul. It's important to note that the ICG advisory note has a paragraph actually has been included. No, actually, I think is in the ICC. Now I'm mixing on the sort of journalism, the attacks on journalists. So it's been reviewed in international law because we tend to forget that journalists are civilians and are protected by Geneva Convention. So thank you very much, Shada, who left already, Xavier, Jean-Paul, Elisabetta, and Gemma for making this possible. Thank you very much for all the participants, which I hope we are all contributing to fight disinformation in our daily life. So I wish you a wonderful day and hoping to meet you soon in another debate.
All right. Thank you very much.
Nice. Goodbye.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye-bye.